Diane pulled into the driveway just after 9, a pecan pie balanced carefully in her hands, still warm from the oven. But the driveway wasn't hers this morning. It belonged to a dozen unfamiliar cars, bumper to bumper, strangers' cars, filling every inch of space where her son's family used to greet her. She counted 3 she didn't recognize before she even reached the porch. Renee opened the door with a smile that had clearly been practiced in a mirror. "Diane, you're early." Her tone was warm, rehearsed, already moving past the question Diane hadn't asked yet. With 40 of her own relatives arriving, Renee explained, space was tight. Diane could freshen up in the garage. A cot had already been set up beside the folded holiday decorations. Diane said nothing. She set the pie down on the entry table, steady-handed, and looked past Renee into the house. "Where's Michael?" 3 years earlier, when Michael lost his job and the mortgage payments stopped, Diane had signed her name without hesitation. She never mentioned the number out loud, not once, not even to her closest friends. Since her husband passed, she'd hosted every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every small birthday that mattered. She watched her grandchildren on weeknights so Michael and Renee could breathe, never asking for so much as a thank you card in return. She only ever wanted to feel welcome in the family she'd helped hold together. But somewhere over the last 2 years, the hosting had quietly changed hands. Renee picked the menus now. Renee chose the seating. Renee decided who sat where, and, slowly, whether Diane sat at the table at all. Diane had given money, labor, love, steady and unspoken. What came back to her this morning was a cot beside the Christmas boxes. The garage wasn't the first sign. It was just the loudest. In the spring, there had been the school recital, the one Diane found out about only after seeing the photos online, the seat beside her grandson empty because no one had thought to save it, or to call. Renee said it must have slipped through the cracks. Michael said nothing at all. Then came the guest room. The one with the quilt Diane had sewn herself, the one she'd slept in every visit since her husband died. She arrived one weekend to find it stripped bare, a yoga mat unrolled where the bed used to be. Renee called it, reclaiming space. At a block party that summer, Renee introduced her to new neighbors with a bright wave of her hand. "This is Michael's mom." Not Diane. Just a title, easily forgotten. Each time, Diane told herself Renee was simply finding her footing as lady of the house. She had once been the one who opened her door to everyone. Now she was the one being quietly walked out of the room. "It's only temporary," Renee added, a little too brightly, filling the silence Diane hadn't offered to fill. "You can pop in for dinner once the real family's finished eating. There just won't be room at the table before then." The real family. Diane let the words settle without flinching. She looked past Renee, down the hallway, hoping to catch her son's eyes. Michael stood near the kitchen doorway, coffee mug in hand, studying the floor like it owed him an answer. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. His silence said everything his voice wouldn't. Diane didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or ask him to choose. She simply lifted her pie from the entry table, met Renee's eyes, and said, "Thank you for being honest with me." Then she walked back to her car. Renee smiled, satisfied, certain the matter was closed. She had no idea what Diane had just decided. Diane drove home in silence, the pie untouched on the passenger seat beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't call Michael to demand an explanation. She simply set the pie on her own kitchen counter and let the quiet settle around her, the way it had settled around her all morning. The next day, she called Ellen, her attorney friend of 30 years, and asked her to begin the paperwork. There was a pending mortgage refinance, one that had been waiting on Diane's signature as co-signer and guarantor for weeks. She would not be signing it. That afternoon, she also canceled the standing $400 transfer she'd sent Renee's account every month for 2 years, quietly, without announcement. She left the family group chat without a word of explanation. No confrontation. No dramatic phone call. Just the slow, deliberate withdrawal of support no one had ever thought to acknowledge. 2 days later, Michael's phone buzzed with a call from his loan officer. He didn't yet understand why. By the weekend, the refinance had officially fallen through. The loan officer's message was clear: without Diane's signature, the numbers no longer worked, and the house itself was suddenly at risk. Michael, flustered and cornered in his own living room, tried to explain to Renee's relatives, still lingering from the holiday, why the deal had collapsed. The explanation required admitting something he'd never said out loud: his mother had been quietly covering costs for years. The room went still. 40 guests who had marveled at Renee's polished hosting, her spotless house, her effortless generosity, now understood how much of it had been built on money and labor she'd never once acknowledged. The cracks were impossible to unsee. That night, Michael finally turned to Renee and asked the question he should have asked weeks earlier: why the garage? Why his mother? He realized, slowly, it had never been about space. It had been about control. He drove to Diane's house to apologize, and found her in her own dining room, arranging chairs for a small second Thanksgiving with old friends and neighbors, humming quietly to herself. Michael stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking younger than he had in years. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said. "Can you just come back, help us fix things with Renee?" Diane set down the napkin she'd been folding and looked at him steadily. "I'm not angry, Michael. I want you to understand that." Her voice was calm, unhurried, the way it had always been. "I'm just done being an afterthought in my own family." He started to speak, but she continued, gently. "I love you. I will always love you. But respect isn't something I'm willing to keep re-earning whenever it's convenient for someone else." He mentioned the mortgage then, the trouble it had caused, almost pleading. Diane shook her head softly. "That was never mine to carry alone, and it shouldn't have to be now." There was nothing he could say to that. For the first time, he didn't try. Weeks later, Diane's dining room filled again, friends, neighbors, warm laughter, candles lit early against the dark. It was smaller than the Thanksgiving she'd missed, but it was hers. Every seat at that table had been chosen with care. Michael came alone, without Renee, and asked quietly if there was room for one more. Diane didn't hesitate. She simply set another place, no conditions attached, no grudge tucked beneath the plate. She had learned something in those quiet weeks: love was never meant to be an obligation, and neither was money. Being included out of guilt had never once felt like belonging. But this, a chair offered freely, a door opened by choice, this felt like peace. And peace, she'd come to understand, was worth far more than a seat at someone else's table.